It has been quite some time since I reviewed Lackadaisy, and based on the feedback on that video and the overall attitude of its fans, I was hesitant to even review Ingenue, but I figured I would at least humor myself and give this 5-minute animation a watch, expecting it to not leave any sort of lasting impression on me, or produce anything of high enough value for me to be motivated to spend my time reviewing it. But once those 5 minutes had passed, I was so shocked by what I had just watched that I knew I had to review it, as I just witnessed pure artistic genius. Do keep in mind that all of my knowledge of Lackadaisy is purely made up of the knowledge that was presented to me via the pilot, and I haven't read any of the webcomic at all, because if you have to read material outside of the show itself, and the show never advises you to read said material before watching the episode, then the show fails at being a competent standalone product as far as storytelling goes. I'm going to go over a summary of the events that happened within this mini episode, so if you want to get right to the review, skip to the time displayed on screen. The episode starts with a flashback to the past, with a man named Ruby, accompanied by a young Ivy delivering a high-quality automobile to a man named Atlas. While Ruby is showcasing the car to Atlas, Ivy walks into a nearby garage and stumbles into Mordecai. Ivy notices that Mordecai's arm is in a sling and inquires as to what happened, and Mordecai gets defensive, evading answering her question. During the exchange, Ivy notices that Mordecai has a pistol holstered under his jacket and begins to question him on why he needs one, but is interrupted when Mitzi asks Ivy if she wants to join her at the cafe. Ivy declines, but when she turns back, Mordecai is gone. Ivy then goes to inspect what Victor is up to, as he's working on repairing a car. Victor isn't interested in talking to Ivy, to her annoyance, but to cheer her up, he humors her and makes up a fun story about how Mordecai broke his arm, lightening the mood. Ivy and Victor warm up to each other, but when Victor realizes he's getting too attached, he shouts at her to leave, as it's too dangerous to be associated with them. On her way out, Ivy notices that there's a spare car door with bullet holes in it, and Mitzi calls everyone over for a picture. Ivy deduces that Victor and Mordecai are gangsters and subtly calls them out, ending the episode with the group having their picture taken. So just as the summary suggests, this mini episode is nothing more than characters just talking to each other, so the importance of Ingenue handling its characters well is more important than anything else in this mini episode, and the characterization didn't live up to the task. It absolutely crushed it. Ivy's the main focus of this mini episode, and for her just being a kid, we learn a lot about her. Ingenue tries really hard to sell Ivy's childlike sense of wonder and innocence, and it does so excellently. Her entire character in this episode is primarily her optimistically and unapologetically asking questions, establishing her as a social butterfly. This may seem like a simple detail for her character because it is, but what I love about how Ingenue portrays this facet of her personality is that it establishes the plot of this episode. All that is really happening in this episode is Ruby selling Atlas a car, but it's because of Ivy's outgoing personality that this run-of-the-mill errand is turned into a charming and adorable detective story. Her personality is not only the most enjoyable facet of this episode, but it's because of her inquisitive nature that she uncovers something she shouldn't have, creating a plot hook for the viewer. It's natural, subtle, and simple storytelling that doesn't try too hard to pretend like it's anything more than a kid just exploring, and I was completely captivated. Ingenue could have completely gone away with just having childlike charisma be all there is to Ivy's character, and I would have mostly been fine with it, as she is this entry's entertainment value, taken manifest, but to my surprise and utter delight, we also learn more about this character. Ruby is a blank slate of a character. We know nothing about him except for one thing. It's that Ivy enjoys the time she spends with him. This isn't revolutionary writing for a kid to want to spend more time with someone, but it establishes that Ruby is important to Ivy for reasons that are withheld from the viewer, which made me more interested in what Lackadaisy has to offer in the future because it made me think about the implications this character trait has, how it will come into play in the future, and made me engage with the show by provoking me into asking questions. Who is Ruby? What is his relationship with Ivy? Why does she care about him so much? And if this is the past and we didn't see him in the pilot, what happened to him? The line where Ivy states this fact didn't have to be here, as the show could have just used context clues for the viewer to figure out that Ivy cares about Ruby, which would have been more subtle, but by having Ivy outright say it and have the scene where she says it focus on her and nothing else was essentially a call to action for the viewer to be more interested in not only Ruby as a character, but empathize with Ivy, building a small emotional attachment with the character right away, so for the rest of the episode we have more reason to care about what Ivy experiences throughout the events of Ingenue. And it's once she bumps into Mordecai that things get really interesting. For anyone who watched the pilot may know, Mordecai is not on the same team as Ivy and Victor in the future. So his presence here adds a whole new mystery to be solved in future installments on why his allegiance changed, making the viewer more interested in this character and adds another reason to look forward to future episodes. As for Mordecai himself, unlike Ivy, we learn nothing new about him, which feels like a missed opportunity, but I guess one could argue that him even being here in the first place is learning something big about his story, so I can't really say that Ingenue should have done more with Mordecai, as on top of adding a mystery to Lackadaisy, he also serves as the plot device for Ivy's detective story to start when she gets a glance of his gun. Lastly, there is Victor, who we didn't see much of in the pilot, so I was interested the most in seeing more of him in this episode, and at first it seemed to be the same serious Russian archetype he was portrayed as in the pilot that nearly disappointed me, but once he warms up to Ivy and creates a wholesome feel-good exchange between the two, I was completely taken off guard as every expectation I had for this character was shattered, as I would have never expected Victor of all people to have one of the most enjoyable personalities of any character in Lackadaisy once he warms up to Ivy, which made him giving Ivy the cold shoulder later in the episode that much more emotionally painful, as I think I was probably as hurt as Ivy was when he pushed her away, completely taking me off guard for the second time within only a minute after Victor caught me off guard the first time. I can't say I was particularly impressed with how Mordecai was handled in this episode, but he did serve a very important purpose of getting the audience more invested in the show, but Ivy and Victor on the other hand, I fell completely in love with. I felt like I went through my own emotional arc with Victor, as this character who I thought I had figured would be a one-note archetype surprised me not once, but twice, and within that short wholesome interaction with Ivy, I became completely invested with his character, and I can only pray that he gets an arc in the future where we can see more of that wholesome side of him again, as it felt like a natural juxtaposition to his more serious and intimidating personality, but not feeling so detached from who he is, as even when he's trying to be nice, you can tell that he's not used to it and comes off as awkward in an endearing way. As for Ivy, it's amazing how one 5-minute flashback can take one of the most boring and generic characters from the pilot and not only develop her into the most interesting character in the show, but also make her my favorite. I also want to give a passing mention to Atlas, Mitzi, and Ruby. I really have nothing to say about them personality-wise, but that brief tense stare-down between Ruby and Atlas was very confusing in a good way, as I look forward to learning the context behind why that scene happened. Like I mentioned earlier, if I had to describe this episode in any way, it's a cleverly disguised detective story, as Ivy is trying to figure out what Mordecai and Victor are hiding, and even though it's obvious that they are criminals, I was fully invested in discovering what they were hiding, as this is a flashback, and since there is so little that is known about Mordecai and Victor at this point, I didn't know what to expect, which is why I was a little disappointed that what they were hiding was something that the viewer had already known, and I would have appreciated if we had learned something new as a payoff for following along on Ivy's investigation, and I also wish that Ivy was a little bit more subtle and indirect when calling out Mordecai and Victor on being gangsters. But with all that being said, the true payoff of this mystery that Ivy is solving was the journey, and not the destination, due to some subtle visual contextual clues sprinkled out throughout the episode that you might not notice on your first viewing, such as the door that Victor is replacing on the car has a reinforced steel barrier that is being added after the previous door that Ivy discovered later on had been easily penetrated with bullets. This attention to detail and visual storytelling was completely unneeded, but was much appreciated, showcasing that when Lackadaisy wants to, even in a mini flashback episode like this one, this project isn't cutting corners on quality and is willing to add completely unnecessary details for the viewer's enjoyment, reassuring the viewer that this project is willing to respect the audience's perception and deduction skills, making piecing together these subtle details to complete this visual backstory feel like a reward in and of itself. Now, on to an aspect about not only Ingenue, but Lackadaisy as a whole that I am very passionate about. The background music, or I should say, lack thereof. Just like the pilot, Lackadaisy is lacking in presenting any memorable or standout background tracks to set the mood, but what it offered instead was pure aesthetic genius. In place of a traditional BGM, Lackadaisy opts for focusing on nailing the ambiance of the setting it takes place in with some downright masterful sound design. Throughout the entire episode, from beginning to end, every single interaction and every single moment is accompanied by an ambient sound to immerse you into the world, be it trains passing by in the distance, the clattering of Victor's tools as he works on the car, a radio reporting the news, and of all of them, what I consider the most vital, a record player distantly playing music. Like I said, Ingenue doesn't have any background music, and that is true, but only if you are thinking of background music in the traditional way, as an augmenting facet to keep scenes from feeling awkward or drawn out. But in place of this vital aspect of any show, Ingenue instead has a looping song playing on a record player in the distance that immersed me in the world more than any traditional accompanying track ever could. In real life, there is no such thing as background music. The closest we ever get is someone playing a song while we idly work or go about our everyday lives. But in real life, that music is often interrupted by other accompanying sounds or becomes quieter as you create distance between yourself and its source, and Lackadaisy Ingenue replicates that real life feeling perfectly. The best thing I could compare the way sound design in Ingenue is handled is to one of those POV playlists you find on YouTube where there is like a party happening in the next room over that creates a sense of nostalgia for the viewer, and Ingenue essentially took that idea and put it in the background of the entire episode, utilizing that sense of familiarity to make the world come to life and creates an immersive and aesthetic effect that I don't think any animated show has done before. Furthermore, this subtle and simple sound design choice that normally consists without interacting with the events of the episode is utilized one time to force the viewer into feeling a certain way about a certain scene. When Victor slams the car door telling Ivy to leave, the record player that has been accompanying the entire episode ends, removing the reliable sense of comfort it had been supplying, which passively puts the viewer on edge to reflect how Ivy is feeling in that scene. This moment is also accompanied by some crows cawing in the distance while flying away, which is a traditional filmmaking omen of unsettling the viewer and conveying that something is wrong. As I mentioned earlier, all the audio cues and distant record player up to this point hadn't been used in any synchronized way with the events of the episode to maintain the naturally calming and nostalgic feeling that this episode is aiming for. So when that consistency is broken in this scene, it makes the impact on the viewer hit that much harder, just showing off the audio director's prowess in using sound design to affect the audience. This effect continues as once Ivy walks away from Victor and the record player keeps spinning despite the song having ended, creating an eerie noise that makes Ivy's investigation of the door scene all that more tense. Every single choice the Lackadaisy team made regarding sound design and background music was so simplistic yet incredible. The use of unorthodox methods and detailed sound design to create an immersive and comforting atmosphere that I don't think could have been done any better than what they did here far surpassed the industry standard of typical background music to elevate the medium of entertainment. And I think that just sums up overall how I feel about Ingenue. Everything about it is so simple yet masterful at just about everything it does. The characters didn't do anything of true importance, but the simple act of them just talking to one another so that the audience can get to know them felt so real and endearing. The pacing was basically perfect, for every second felt like it was used to either benefit the characters or immerse you in the setting, with each scene moving swiftly enough for you to never get bored by a scene, but not so quickly that I felt like I was being dragged away from a scene that I was invested in and being forced into a new one. The focus on ambiance in place of a traditional soundtrack genuinely felt like it was an act of artistic and creative genius, and will be an example I point to on how to use sound design to elevate something as simple as two characters talking in a garage. Lackadaisy Ingenue is 5 minutes of artistic perfection, lacking any real noticeable flaws, and excelling at every aspect it presented in one way or another. It's amazing how one 5-minute flashback understands the importance of just having characters interact with each other more than almost all of the biggest indie animated series on YouTube. which, believe me, is reassuring, as I started to feel like I was going crazy by how literally no other major indie animated show can comprehend the important humanizing effect an unimportant interaction between characters can make, as it allows the audience to get to know the characters better, and as a result makes the audience feel more invested in the characters' stories and whatever future awaits them. Don't get me wrong, I do understand the indie animation industry typically doesn't have the time to dedicate 5 straight minutes towards characters just talking with each other, and I don't even expect Lackadaisy to keep on doing this in the actual show. But I think it's more than reasonable to expect at least a 5-minute scene like this, one in maybe every other episode, where we can see characters de-stress and just be themselves, without there being any plot element to alter their conversations or how they act. But besides that, if you consider every other element I mentioned that culminates into making Lackadaisy Ingenue into an animated masterpiece, I consider this bite-sized animated piece of art as what should be considered the new industry standard for every creator to strive for, and if the main Lackadaisy series keeps delivering quality like Ingenue did, I have no doubt that Lackadaisy will become the best web series to ever grace the internet, and its current competition won't even come close to its level of mastery.
Looks real solid. Good job.